Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are based in. My name is Jagannath Panda. I heads the Indo-Pacific Center at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Sweden. We welcome all of you for this webinar on the climate crisis in Tibet. This is a project which ISDP is engaged with for the last few months and will be carrying out till the end of this year. This project, which is of a significant value from the South Asian point of view, particularly looking at the issues, at the changes that are happening in Tibet pertaining to climate change and environment. This project, particularly looking at the climate challenges that the Himalayan regions is going to face, particularly taking into consideration the Chinese activities that is being carried out in the Tibetan Plateau. In order to discuss some of these issues, we had planned this project into a range of webinars. We had a first round of webinars last month in December, which generally talked about the climate challenges that is emerging in the Tibetan Plateau and which is gradually turning into a severe crisis. Today, in the second round of this webinar, we'll be discussing more about the infrastructural development, particularly the dam construction project that the Chinese are currently planning to undertake, and some of them are already in progress. In order to discuss some of these projects that the Chinese are planning to continue over the next 1 decade or so, we have a terrific panel of speakers who have actually worked on the subject for a number of years to discuss about it more from a critical and objective point of view. I am not going to read their bio profile in details because all of the informations are there in the website. But just to briefly introduce to them, to all of you, we have Dr. Antonina. She's actually has been a speaker for some of our webinars earlier in ISDP, but she's an expert on China-India relations, particularly covering the issues in the Himalayan regions, particularly about the Chinese activities in the Himalayan regions. She has worked for many years on the water issues. Particularly, she is currently working as an assistant professor at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. She is also a former Fulbright senior scholar and also the founding director of the Taiwan Lab Research Center in Krakow at the Jagiellonian University. Welcome to you, Antonina, and we are looking forward to have your insights. We have then John Jones. He heads head of the campaigns, policy and research at Free Tibet and Tibet Works network. He has worked on a number of years on the Tibetan issues, covering from the practical and from the field point of view. He has traveled to the ground, covering some of the practical issues in the regions. He's widely networked in the regions. He has written enormously on the environmental and ecological developments that is taking place in the Tibetan Plateau, covering the dam projects as well as some of the mining issues in the regions. Welcome, John. We have then Dr. Medha Bist. She's an associate professor at the Department of International Relations at the South Asian Universities, which is a initiative of the SAARC countries. She has actually a well-known expert on the water and the climate issues. And she has been writing on the water diversion project that the Chinese are carrying out in the Tibetan Plateau for a long time. She's an expert on the river issues in the Himalayan regions, and you could see her writings in different international forums. Welcome to you, Medha. Then we have Ms. Detention Palmo. She is from the Tibet Policy Institute and environmental researcher covering on transboundary rivers. Particularly, she covers on the Mekong rivers and Brahmaputra rivers. That's the kind of developments which is taking place. She is currently engaged with a lot of projects which covers the water and the river issues in the regions. And it would be interesting to know her perspective more from the Tibetan point of view. Welcome to you, Detention. Then we have Dr. Anna Hayes, who is based in Australia. She belongs from the James Cook Universities, where she is a senior lecturer in international relations. She's a China specialist, covers developments about Chinese foreign policy pertaining to Xinjiang and other domestic regions of China. She has written an interesting piece co-authored with Jonathan Ping in our earlier projects in the China's Himalayan Hustle projects. So it would be interesting to know her views about how the Chinese are looking at some of these water-related projects and infrastructure-related projects in the Tibetan Plateau. So welcome all of you. We are really privileged to have all of you in this webinar. We'll keep this webinar engaging, interactive, so that you feel free to express your opinion. You are free to take your position on the subject. But one of the points at the outset I will raise, just to flagging the discussion to keep rolling, is that this dam construction business in Tibet is nothing new. As you know, I think it is there for last 1 decade or a couple of decades, and probably the Chinese are continuously and systematically building some of these dams. But what is really alarming is that I think this new announcement about the dam construction, which is in the Himalayan part of the regions, and which is going to affect the entire regions, affecting the climate as well as the environmental and spatial, ecological spatial issues in the regions. When it comes to irrigation, when it comes to hydroelectric generation programs, as well as in terms of diversing and controlling the waters in the regions. These are raising a lot of alarming, environment and climate conditions in the regions. So how do you really see the recent announcement that the Chinese have done pertaining to their new dam construction activities? That is number one. Number two, how do you really see that China can be engaged in a discussion or brought into a negotiating table in terms of, inviting them or creating a pressure zone on them to stop some of these construction activities? Do you really see that there is a possibility that the world could actually, unite on some of these issues? Because as you know, Tibet is a critical ecological domain for the world geographical canvas. It's known as the third pole. Any climate impact or climate changes in the regions is going to enormously affect not only the regions, the Himalayan regions, but also the entire human geography. So I would invite initially each one of your comments in 4 to 5 minutes, so that we could keep this discussion, flowing from here on. So with this note, let me first invite Antonina to share your views. How do you see some of the recent announcement of China, and how does it impact the climate conditions in Tibet? Over to you, Antonina.
Thank you, Jagannath. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this terrific and very much needed project of yours and of the ISDP Center. So let me just set the stage and set the foundation for our discussion by briefly talking about the most recent project, or rather the announcement of the most recent project that China is going to implement in Tibet, namely on the Brahmaputra River, or the Tibetan or Chinese, if you will, part of the Brahmaputra River, in the place where it makes this kind of U-turn before it actually enters the territory of India. So the Chinese side announced the plans of building the biggest dam in the world. So far, China does possess the biggest dam in the world, which serves as a hydropower plant. It's called the Three Gorges Dam. However, it is estimated that the new project will be 3 times bigger, and therefore the dam will have the 3 times bigger capacity of producing electricity than the currently largest dam in the world, which, as I said, exists in China, and whose construction resulted in the relocation of 1.4 million people. So it is estimated that the cost of this new project will be 1 trillion renminbi, or 1 trillion yuan, so the Chinese currency, which translates into more or less 137 billion US dollars. So it's probably the amount that none of us can actually visualize or actually truly understand how much it really is. So as you can imagine, it will be a huge, costly, and very dangerous project. So the Indian side has already labeled it as a world's riskiest project. Why? Because it's a very unique region. it's very, well, the topography is very specific. So we are talking about the part of Brahmaputra where we have a 2,000 meters steep descent at the span of just 50 kilometers. So basically, it's a very, very steep region. So it has perfect conditions for putting a dam and producing electricity. Perfect in theory, because practically speaking, it may cause a lot of threats. So apart from or in addition to relocating local population, as it happens in most of the cases of dam constructions, we are also talking about increasing the risk of earthquakes. So even today, this is a very seismologically active area. But if you put another dam, especially such a huge, vast dam, then you further increase the risk of earthquakes. And let us just, point out to the fact that since the announcement of that plan by the Chinese side, we already had two pretty big earthquakes in this region, one of which resulted in the death of more than 100 people. And we haven't even started building the dam yet. So it also gives us an idea what kind of threats we are talking about. We are also talking about the increased risk of floods, of landslides. So basically, we have both environmental issues or threats as well as social consequences. As I mentioned, the relocation of local population, which usually prompts local Tibetan population to protest, and various NGOs, various organizations which monitor these actions have been alarming about, protests and arrests and beating people and people disappearing after those protests. So we also have very, very serious local social consequences. So, and as you mentioned at the very beginning, Jagannath, this is not just China's internal matter. We understand that China is facing water scarcity, just like most of the countries in the world, due to the ongoing global climate change. And China is therefore very thirsty for water, if I can use that very literal metaphor. However, as you mentioned at the very beginning, it is actually an international issue, because whatever China as a hydro hegemon, as the upper level, country does on its rivers, it will actually affect all countries down the stream. So speaking of Brahmaputra, we might have grave consequences for India and Bangladesh.
Thank you, Antonina. I think I do agree with you that this is a continental matter. We'll come back to you for further discussion. Maybe John, you would like to go next? Yeah.
Yeah, Antonina's done much of my job for me by giving all of the sort of technical aspects to it. I think the points that I can add are that it was interesting, the timing of the announcement, and perhaps who the announcement was aimed at, every bit as much as the sort of technical marvel behind this huge project, which was reported very breathlessly by the media. But I saw fewer mentions of the fact that it came right at the end of the year, and that it might have been aimed at sort of staking China's claim to this territory alongside the Indian border. I did see one or two experts say that this might be as much to do with the territory as the river. And one of the reasons they're saying that is because there's all kinds of reasons to be a little hesitant about whether this project will proceed, and certainly the knowledge of it. Antonina's given some great examples. The earthquake that took place in Shigatse weeks after the announcement prompted an investigation of, I believe, 14 hydropower dams across Tibet. Cracks were found in 5 of them, and 3 of the reservoirs have since had to be emptied. This area of the Yarlung Tsangpo has seen landslides in the past that have buried villages. And also, there's been long-standing warnings, including from Chinese engineers and geologists. The Great Bend in the river in the Yarlung Tsangpo, before it shoots down this 2,000 meters of this 50-kilometer stretch, has been prized by Chinese engineers. Going back into the 2010s, at least, some of them calling it like the Great Hope for carbon neutrality, the Great Hope for humanity, something that they absolutely have to pursue. But other ones were saying, around the same time, they were looking at, for example, the Three Gorges Dam, and they were noticing a 70% rise in landslides and other accidents there due to the waters in the reservoir rising and making the surrounding area increasingly unstable. There was one report back in 2012 that noted 430 landslides and close to 3,000 smaller geological incidents that have been recorded since the construction of that dam, including landslides that would crash into the river and generate waves that were like 60 feet high that would claim the lives of people. 14 people were killed by one such wave. And then there was another incident where 31 people were killed in a landslide in which it buried a bus. Going even further back, there's Chinese scientists talking about the Longyangsha hydropower station on the Machu River, saying that they'd seen a rise in geological disasters and significant landslides at the start of this century. Another Chinese expert, Fan Jiao, he's an environmentalist and geological expert. He noted 2 years ago, with reference to this dam, the Meidog hydropower station, that it would be unnecessary and it would be inconvenient given the instability of the land and given the fact that the cost of transmitting the energy would be higher than dams in other parts of Tibet. What he did note is that the increased GDP, investment and tax revenue generated by these projects might be a reason to proceed, rather than the environmental impact of them. So I think when we're analysing this dam, we have to be thinking about the location, the territory right against India. We have to be thinking about some of the financial reasons for it, every bit as much as the benefits that the Chinese government touts with this dam towards its aim of being hitting net zero in 2060, and interrogating some of the claims that the Chinese government is making about this. The dam is supposed to be ready in 2033. Tibet Watch, my organisation, has yet to see any environmental impact assessment or anything that would tell us how this is going to happen. We're going to be a little bit sceptical about it, but obviously, even though there's many reasons not to build it, that doesn't mean that it won't eventually happen. We'll be watching closely, I think, is the way I'll round off my section.
Thank you, John. I think those are interesting remarks. Again, particularly 2 points about the timing of the announcement of the dams, which is really strategic. And I do agree with you. There is this argument that the Chinese are systematically trying to change the status quo on the boundary issue with India. So there is clearly a linkages there. And the second is about the 2033 plan, their systematic development about diversion of the projects, diversion of the water from the Tibetan Plateau to the northern part of China. I'll come to you, Medha. You have been watching about the river flow in the Himalayan regions and the water issues so closely. How do you really link it and see the issues more from the China and the boundary dispute and from the local point of view, from the Himalayan perspective? Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Shall I just turn on my camera, or it's just very, or shall I just continue, Jagannath? Because
yeah, please,
I think
please continue.
Yes, yes. So, I think when we're really thinking or when we really try to analyze China's hydropolitics, any kind of strategic interpretation, to my mind, demands that one really gets or gives a perspective to Chinese strategic insights. And I always say good strategic foresight, should always be backed and informed by strategic hindsight. So in that context, before, of course, we come into the ecological issues, which I think the first speaker highlighted, I think one really needs to go back to 1995 when Jiang Zemin, in his speech in 1995, talked about economic growth in Western China. And here, Western region primarily included around 6 Chinese provinces, 3 autonomous regions. Of course, one of them was Tibet, and a municipality under the direct control of the central government. Now, the political guidelines, which were in fact articulated in the 1995 speech, were soon followed up in the Western Development Program of 1999 and the 12th five-year plan of 2011 to 2015. And the focus here was primarily using water, energy, and minerals as essential resources. So significantly, I think, at this point of time, what was happening that China, at least in its deteriorations, was focusing on the upper and the middle stretches of the Brahmaputra River. In fact, if you remember 2010, the first dam was the Zangmu Dam, which was built in 2011. Zangmu, we all know, is a concrete gravity dam with an installed capacity of 1,000 megawatts.
Hello, hello.
Narrative which really emerges from the dam politics, because interestingly at that point of
Medha,
time,
I'm
yes.
sorry. Just to reiterate that, we lost your connection for a while. So can you just go back a minute before?
Yeah, so I was talking about the Zangmu Dam, which was
Yeah.
built, started, coming up in 2011, and we all know this is a concrete gravity dam. And I'm saying this because it's very important to really look at the strategic chronology with regards to dam building activities. Because interestingly, at this point of time, because I remember reading the reports, there were many dams which were clubbed along with the Zangmu Dam, and all these dams were primarily being built on the upper and the middle stretches of the river, and these were primarily run on the river projects. Like some of these dams are, in fact, the Dagu Dam and the Jiacha Dam. Now, the way I really see it now is that this discourse on the run on the river projects, in fact, really diluted the riparian fears to a certain extent. In fact, there were some statements from New Delhi also that these dams are not for diversion purposes, they are primarily towards meeting water security needs. And in many ways, this became an attention distractor. However, 10 years down the line, we see Zangmu is operational with other auxiliary run on the dam projects. Now, currently, if you see, there are around 193, at least this is what the latest figure says, the one which I saw, hydroelectric dams, and they are being constructed and planned in Tibet. Now, come to the Meadog Dam, which is also known as the Super Dam. And this really completes the circle, because what has really garnered fears now is because this dam is now being primarily built in the lower stretches of the Brahmaputra. We all know, I mean, being talked about, it was announced in 2021, is the focus of the 14th five-year plan of China. And in fact, this dam had always been a China's dream. Interestingly, this area opened up eventually, initially as for adventure tourism in 2002, and in fact gave Chinese planners an accurate picture of the terrain. Now, this is a 60 megawatt project and is a concrete gravity dam. It's huge in its proportion. It was just pointed out. And in fact, this dam has always been a China's dream. Interestingly, this dam has now been primarily built in the lower stretches of the Brahmaputra. Now,
Hello,
coming to the development and construction of green and smart
hello.
ecological
Medha,
civilization, and
I'm
we all
sorry.
know
We
that
just
2005,
again,
2006, there was a subtle shift in green energy and
Medha,
green
we
industrial
lost you for
policy.
a moment.
So in now post, if you really look at pre 2010, the issue of dams was not really in the public domain. It's only post 2010 that China's dam plans have started really coming out. And if you remember, in 2011, interestingly, there was a field investigation which was taken up by the Chinese authorities, which showed that the Brahmaputra originated from the Yangtze Glacier and not the Chema Yangdong Glacier, which India believes to be the origin of Brahmaputra. Now, whether this has political significance is left for anyone's guess, but Tibet today, I think, not only has geoecological but also geoeconomic and geopolitical connotations. And I would say Tibet, therefore, is a part of a larger strategic matrix with not only water, energy, economic needs, but also a part of, as I say, the Himalayan Indo-Pacific strategy when it really comes to India-China relations. So maybe on the second round, in detail, we could probably talk about the ecological consequences. Do you want me to cover this now, or maybe we can do that later?
We will come back to the second round, Medha. Thank you very much. Interesting observation, but we kept on losing you for a moment. So
Oh, I
mix
thought
your
so.
make sure in the second round you have a stable internet connection. So let me
I don't know
invite.
what's the reason.
Let me
Yes, I think so. There
come.
is a problem today.
Thank you, Medha. Maybe now I invite Detention to share our views. Detention, over to you.
Thank you so much for giving opportunity to speak on this very important and critical issue. So this issue is indeed and demand an urgent attention. So we all know that China's government have recently announced that they have approved this project on the Yarlung Tsangpo lower reaches. So it was first formally was included in the 14th five-year plan. And as we know that this Yarlung Tsangpo originating from Tibet flows into India and Bangladesh, serving a lifeline for millions of people and sustaining agriculture and biodiversity and livelihood across the region. So this announcement at this period raised serious concern, not only for Tibetan, but also for the downstream countries like India and Bangladesh. So according to the Chinese government official statement, they claim that the project will support carbon neutrality goals and improve the livelihood and promote the economic prosperity in the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region. However, this justification do not take into account the environmental, social, and geopolitical implication of damming on Yarlung Tsangpo. So this proposed dam, it is located on the Yarlung Tsangpo Grand Canyon National Nature Reserve. So according to the Article 32 of the Chinese Regulation on Nature Reserve, so there shouldn't be any production facilities which are permitted in the core or the buffer zone of this nature reserve. So yet this project directly violates their own regulation. And furthermore, this dam construction also displaced around 24,217 Tibetan residents who are living along the rivers and the dam sites. So this disregards the rights and the tradition of the Tibetan communities who have lived and coexist with this river for generations. And this Chinese government, they are also have planned to drill at least 420 kilometers long tunnel through the Namcha Parva mountain and threatening the regional fragile ecology. So Namcha Parva mountain is considered very sacred in Tibetan also. So moreover, the Yarlung Tsangpo is also located at the very highly active tectonic plate belt. And this many scientists, especially Chinese scientists, they have warned that such huge construction in this area could trigger landslide or earthquakes. So as John have mentioned earlier, that with the recent earthquake in Tibet, with magnitude of around 7.1 earthquake, they have damaged several hydropower nearby in this region. So it shows that the dangers of constructing such a dam in seismic region is very dangerous. And furthermore, this is not the only dam that Chinese government are building. There are many hydropower dams which are planned across Tibet. And as per the International Campaign of Tibet, they have bought a report which claimed that there are at least 193 hydropower dams which are being built or planned across Tibet since 2000. And mostly around like 80% of these dams are classified as a large dam. So, and there's also a lack of transparency and the unilateral action of the transboundary rivers. This raises a huge geopolitical concern from downstream countries. So project like this also undermines the regional water security and risk escalating the tension between the downstream countries. So such diversion and the water flow would lead to the flash floods or disasters, and which will have huge impact on the downstream countries like India and Bangladesh. And it is very important for international community to come together and address this environmental and humanitarian impact of these developments in Tibet. So Tibet's rivers are crucial not only for the Tibet ecology balance, but also for the stability of the Asia as a whole. So advocacy for such sustainable management and the right of the community living there, and especially the indigenous rights and the regional cooperation, is very important. So to stop or check this hydropower expansion by the Chinese government. Thank you.
Thank you, Detention. And I think those are interesting remarks again, particularly your concern about how it is changing the identity of Tibet itself, more from the geographical point of view, as well as impacting the climate and environmental issues in the entire Tibet and Himalaya regions. Last but not least, Anna, how do you see the entire episode sitting there in Australia? How do you really assess this particular new announcement of the Chinese government to carry out the new dam, which will have a lasting effect on the environment? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the invitation. So probably the view from Australia is we tend to zoom out a little bit, and that's what I want to do in my contribution today, and think about how Tibet fits within China's expansionist state and its grand strategy. And this is imperative that we think about this within the region, but also ultimately globally. And one of the ways in which they are doing this is via their Belt and Road Initiative, which has attracted a great deal of attention inside of Australia. So like the Uyghur homeland, which is what my research has primarily focused on up until more recently. So it's more commonly known as Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. So since annexation of these frontier regions, including Tibet as an important frontier region, these territories really constitute a colony of the Chinese state. And this is despite Beijing's proclamations that Tibet and Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang, for instance, you'll see it regularly stated that they've been an inseparable part of the motherland since ancient times. So when you start to look at Tibet as a colony of the Chinese state, it's then important to think about, well, how does Beijing operate inside of Tibet, as well as in Inner Mongolia and also the Uyghur homeland? So what we see is Beijing using a combination of settler colonialism that's about bringing Tibet under complete control and to prevent, the uprisings of color revolution, separatism, that sort of thing. Also effectively swamping local populations with Han-in migrants, which over time has altered the ethnic ratio in these regions. But it also operates as an extractive colonial state, and it uses these frontier regions and their natural resources to meet the needs of and to benefit the Chinese core. And we see that with the announcements of these dam constructions, which are described as, sending Western electricity eastwards. Increasingly, this is a process that also involves the extraction of human resources as well via forced labor transfer of minority nationality peoples from these regions to the Chinese core. So these peripheral frontier colonized regions, they are important to Beijing. They're important to the Chinese core regions, and they are also important to the ongoing prosperity of China. So how does this fit with Tibet as a hydropower zone or hydrohegemony? Well, Chinese claims over these contested frontier regions is justified in Beijing under what Abdurrajik Khaluk refers to as a political China approach. So the political China approach means that Beijing sees any area outside of the core territory of the Chinese, or what we might call the Chinese homeland, any area that had in the past come under either direct or indirect Chinese control or indirect rule or sphere of influence, that this falls into the category of political Chinese state. So any of these regions, if they had a dependency on China, if they were a tribute state, whatever it might be, they're viewed as being political China by Beijing. So when it comes to Tibet and its water resources and the hydropolitics within the Himalayan region, the Tibetan Plateau is the prime real estate for a still expansionist China to seek hydrohegemony within the Himalayan region. And in doing so, it's able to then challenge the position of India, for instance, within the region, and also India's sphere of influence. And we also see Beijing's indirect rule over the region is increasing. And it's able to coerce regional states to either accept or to acquiesce to Beijing's demands by virtue of its power as being an upstream state and through the Belt and Road Initiative. So Beijing is using dam construction both inside of Tibet and downstream in other countries via mainly the Belt and Road Initiative to extend its sphere of influence. It's establishing effectively new tribute relations. This is via loan repayments, hosting diplomacy, water diplomacy in the region. And this is increasing Chinese influence and interference in the political and economic and strategic decision-making that's being made in those countries. It's also a pathway for indirect Chinese rule to return. So against this backdrop, China's water diplomacy in the region is increasing the asymmetrical power differences between China and downstream states. And so this means that those states are increasingly susceptible to Chinese influence and indirect rule. It weakens their bargaining position over resources, especially if, quibbles over those water resources and allocations means that other projects under the Belt and Road Initiative are then vulnerable. So to bring this to a conclusion, well, really the combination of these asymmetrical power differences and the power of the Belt and Road Initiative to silence critics due to their concerns over other projects is also likely to reduce efforts that states may engage in to reduce China's powers through, efforts of counter-hegemony by affected states. This in turn makes them more likely to accept China's hegemony within the region and to simply acquiesce to Beijing's goals.
Excellent, Anna, and I think I do agree with you. And 3-4 interesting point, in fact. One is that how the water diversion projects are a part of its expansionist policy, how is it linked with the BRI, and also it is how it explains to a semi-colonial approach that the Chinese are employing in the regions, particularly affecting asymmetrical power dynamics in the region. So these are the 3-4 points, interesting points that you have highlighted. But let me come back to all of you again, and I'll start with John, and then I'll come with detention before I go to Medha. And Medha, I would request you to fix up your internet so that we could hear you clearly. And then I'll come back to you again, Anna, and then Antonina. I'll come to the recent dam construction projects, which is announced recently by China. How do you see this construction of dams are going to affect the climate in the regions, particularly changing the ecological equations in Tibet, and also to what extent it is going to affect the water management policies in the regions, in the Himalayan regions? As you know, Tibet houses a lot of rivers and water flows to the Himalayan regions. So I would be interested, in fact, in the interest of our discussion today, in the interest of the theme, one, that how these dam construction projects are going to affect the climate effect in the Tibet per se, as well as impacting the river flows to the Himalayan regions. John, over to you.
Okay. I'll get through this as quickly as possible because I think that the climate side is probably the speciality of some of the other guests. But I think just to touch on this theme briefly, one of the things that they are doing is having ecological effects on animal habitats. They affect the flow of sediments downriver. They affect the migration of fish, which has a knock-on effect for fisherfolk downriver, including in other countries. And then when we talk about climate impact, I think we have to take into account that building these massive concrete structures does burn fossil fuels, and there's also a subplot with dams in higher reaches where they might be built on Tibet's permafrost. The climate crisis is ravaging Tibet. You sometimes see statistics that it's warming 3 times faster than the global average. And this permafrost is thawing and freezing every year. And underneath this permafrost is a time bomb of methane, which is even more harmful in terms of trapping heat than carbon dioxide. And it's one of the reasons why some of the leading Tibetan environmentalists are recommending that solar power and wind be utilized instead of this rampage of dam construction along all of the major rivers through Tibet. It's also the issue why the Tibetans are highlighting their sovereignty or lack thereof, the fact that Tibet cannot administer its own resources because it was invaded by China in 1950, remains under its occupation, and is at the mercy of policy decisions taken miles away in Beijing. Last year, there was a call by Tibetans around the world for a moratorium on mega development projects inside Tibet, including hydropower dams, which was actually picked up in an article by the BBC in December when talking about one of the dams in Tibet. And they made that case that the social, environmental and ecological damage being caused by these dams will only be fixed if there's some kind of international response, which I think we'll get to in the next section. There is the social side to it as well. It does need to be highlighted that in addition to the harm to the environment, they're causing social and even cultural damage, with two examples being the recent Yangchu Dam that was built in the Yellow or Machu River last year, which flooded Atsuk Monastery, 19th century monastery. The 160 monks there have been displaced. And one of the other speakers alluded to the arrests in Dergi County regarding the Kanto Dam. Protests broke out there in February. They were bigger than we've seen protests from Tibet for a long time. It's very hard to protest in Tibet these days because it's such an atomized and heavily surveilled society. But there was this big protest there against the dam that, according to the public tender document, would see an estimated 4,000 residents needing to be removed from their homes. That's a conservative estimate. The protest was met by police crackdown and mass arrests. This is the trap that Tibetans find themselves in. They're either forced to be spectators to the destruction of their environment and their way of life and their livelihoods, or they can voice very limited protest and dissent and be confronted with police crackdowns. And I'll leave it there.
Excellent. I think I do agree with you. There will be tremendous ecological effects, but more than that, the social and cultural sides. In fact, one of our speaker in the first webinar pointed out about this, that this construction of the infrastructure, particularly the dam projects, are going to also have enormous impact on the cultural sides of Tibet, causing a damage to the cultural and social harmony that Tibet used to have for many years. How do you really see detention effect being having a strong Tibetan background to you? How do you really see, and the issues John pointed out about social and cultural aspects and also ecological effects, how do you really see on both sides what the international community could do? And do you really see a genuine concern really emerging and the entire world really buying to this kind of, the kind of warning that is coming from this diversion of the water diversion projects in the Tibetan regions? How do you see?
Okay, so as Jordan have already mentioned that this dam project is not just an environmental issue, it has also have social and also political issue that need to be required urgent and equal attention. So as we know that there are many scientific reports which claims that Tibetan Plateau is warming twice the global average. And Tibet being the source of major rivers in Asia, like Yangtze, Yellow, which are the lifeline of China, and including the river that flows into India, Brahmaputra, Indus, and Mekong, all these rivers have its source in Tibet. So with the Chinese government policies, although like it has huge impact on the Tibetan communities living there, it has equal impact to the downstream communities. So with the dammings and the climate change, we all know that the climate change, there's a rapid melting of the glaciers, and with this, the dam, which add further stress by reducing the river flow and disrupting the seasonal water availability for the downstream countries. We can clearly see what is happening in the Mekong region. So many of the downstream countries in Mekong, they are facing a lot of difficulties because of the Chinese cascade of dam on the upper Mekong. So, likewise, Tibetan communities, as John have mentioned about the Yangtze River Dam. So there are Chinese government are planning to build around like 13 dams on the upper Yangtze River. And with this building of these dams, recently we have seen that there's a huge protest that happened in the region because of the Chinese government dam construction on the region. And these dams have relocated and forcefully relocated around 6 villages and almost 10 monasteries, which are very important for the Tibetan community living there. And the monasteries, which there are monasteries such as Vondu monasteries, which have history and very important murals and wall painting that have dated back to 13th centuries. And Tibetans are very much involved with such relocation, and that has directly impact their culture and their religiously they have impact. So we have, although like it is difficult for Chinese government to international agencies to encourage Chinese government to stop all these projects, but I think like it is not an impossible one. So what happens in Tibet will have regional implications. So it is important for downstream countries to continue to pressure and strategically engage with the Chinese government to share the data or have consult with the downstream countries before proceeding with such hydropower project in the international rivers. So there's a need for unified advocacy and strong and collective voices from the downstream countries and international agencies and activists is very important. And there's a need for pushing for openness from the Chinese government hydropower plants and need for data sharing with the downstream countries. And as we have seen that China have often used this hydropower as a tool to control the downstream countries. As in 2017, during the Doklam crisis, Chinese government have stopped sharing hydrological data with the Indian. So this has clearly shows that how Chinese government are leveraging this hydropower during the political or military crisis. And so it is important that what happens in Tibet, climate impact with dam construction, and it is not just a regional concern, and it is also have a global climate threat. So methane gas, like there are many scientists which claim that the dam is not so clean as they have claimed, as Chinese government claims, because there is many methane gas which emits from the reservoirs, and also these dams also disrupt the ecosystems, so which undermines the global climate goals. And as talking about the international agencies, it is important for intergovernmental agencies like ICMOD and many, which is an intergovernmental agencies constituting of many of the South Asian countries. They should promote such transboundary water treaties and encourage China to engage with the downstream countries and have multilateral agreement, if not bilateral agreement, with the downstream countries. So moreover, there is also a need to build alliance among the downstream countries. During the COP conference, I often attend the COP conference, and I do visit all those downstream countries to urge the downstream countries representative to talk about the hydropower or transboundary water issue with the Chinese government. However, many of the downstream countries, it is difficult for one countries bilaterally have dialogue with the Chinese government and have some concrete result out of having a dialogue, like what is happening with India. India, it is like, although the Chinese government are building a dam on the Yarlung Tsangpo, it is India, they often raise this concern with the Chinese government. However, there is no any kind of concrete result out of this dialogue. But if the downstream countries, if they build alliance and if they pressurize the Chinese government, there might be have good result if instead of having bilateral agreement. And it is also important to expose the human right and environmental violation that is happening in Tibet. So there are many documents and which present evidence that how this dam project it impacts not only Tibetan communities but also have impact on the downstream communities. So if Chinese government have built dam on the Mekong rivers, upper Mekong rivers, although it is built within the Chinese boundary, but it has impact on beyond the border. So it is important to have put a public pressure on the Chinese government, especially in the global platform. Thank you.
Interesting point. I do agree with your point that there should be much more multilateral agreements or treaties in the interest of the regions, and also keeping in view the way China is controlling the water data sharing, as you cited rightly, the Duklam incident, how they were not really eager to share the the water data, and with India during the crisis. So I think that also reminds us that there has to be a lot more international vigilance regime in terms of human rights organization trying to raise it, and also there has to be a much more cohesive platform internationally where we could have a much more pressure zone, creating a pressure zone on the Chinese government to release data, to come transparent on some of these activities. Medha, how do you think the recent construction activities and the announcement of the Chinese government affecting the climate conditions in the regions?
So I think, much has been said about it, but specifically, I mean, one point which I would like to draw attention to is, people have talked about seismic zone effects, and recently I read a report which said that the 1950 Assam Tibet earthquake, which happened, in fact, has its epicenter in the Medoc County, where this super dam is being constructed. And I think this is not just rhetoric in terms of talking about ecological awareness. I mean, if you just really understand the geology of the Himalayas, these Himalayas are young mountains which are at present being formed. They are continuously being formed, and therefore, earthquakes is really a natural consequence, which landslides, are really natural. But then, how do you, in fact, really make a cascading catastrophe by building it in infrastructure? I think needs to be looked at. Secondly, uh, again, in terms of the disaster and the adaptive measures which are needed, if you really look at the Himalayas, there are around 4,000 plus gloves, which presently are there, and particularly due to the contestation of the borders and this whole privileging of territoriality, as I would say. Uh, uh, a holistic assessment is really lacking in the Himalayas. And in fact, some reports even claim that if you look at the eastern Himalayas in comparison to the western Himalayas, the gloves are in fact really expanding at an alarming rate. And in fact, for the lower riparian countries, these can actually be defined as these ticking time bombs. um, the fourth thing, or in fact, again, something which I would want to emphasize in terms of the environmental issues which can crop up is really the hydrological regimes of the rivers, which we all know is being disturbed. We all know about the shifting Himalayan rivers because they are heavily sedimented, and therefore they shift course over a period of time. But there are also upstream, downstream linkages of these hydrological processes, and they have been well documented. The impact, as again people have pointed out, can be institutional as well as cultural. Um, One of the things which is really coming up, Tibet is considered to be a barrier, a buffer to desertification. And in fact, some reports point out that due to the destruction of the grasslands there are increasing possibilities of it really being desertified. In fact, Gyama Valley in Tibet, polymetallic deposits were found in there because of critical mineral mining, which is taking place. And in 2017, I remember reading some reports that the water of Brahmaputra was primarily black. So these are some of the environmental ecological issues, and of course you have monsoon patterns and weather patterns in Tibet, which are primarily linked to the ecosystem of South Asia. So with these, I think I'll end in, but these are, yes, some of this broad ecological consequences which I really see, which could really happen in near future, and some of the effect which is really being felt at present too.
Excellent, Medha. I do agree with you, the monsoon effect and the wind directions. But at the same time, we need an holistic assessment of the situation. Anna, how do you see it affecting the climate, changes in the regions, particularly the ecological dimension in the region?
Yeah, this is a question where I'd probably got to defer to the other panelists for the ecological dimensions. I mean, that's sort of out of the scope of my particular expertise. Probably, I mean, like John and in addition, I sort of think in approaching this question more around the impacts on Tibetans themselves in terms of these dam constructions. The protests have been raised a number of times, and that kind of protest, as John said, is extremely rare nowadays. There's really no tolerance for dissent in the what are usually called the restive regions of Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia. So the fact that Tibetans did go out and protest in this way is quite a considerable testament to how they see the potential ecological impacts of these dam constructions, as well as the social and cultural impacts of them. And, when we look at these kinds of mega projects, they do have various impacts, not only on the natural environment, but obviously on those people living in the pathway of these projects. And with, Tibetan people, well, first of all, there's the relocation of significant numbers of people. This causes incredible social dislocation. You have the breakup of communities and neighborhoods, even whole townships being moved in some instances. And the economic toll that this imposes is really quite significant as well. Even though you'll have the government saying, well, they'll be properly compensated, there'll be reparations, these kinds of things, they usually tend to fall short of what is appropriate and what is promised. And there's usually a significant degree of coercion in this practice as well. And we saw that in Kashgar, for instance, with the relocation projects there. And Deshan was talking about this, that destruction of important cultural and religious sites, that's really quite significant as well, including, ancient monasteries and relics. So this is all part and parcel of the unfolding cultural genocide that's been underway in Tibet. This is a process really that started with the 1950 annexation. It's continued from that time, and it's been carried out, at different periods under different policies. It's waxed and waned at times, sometimes less intense, sometimes more intense. And I mean, in terms of looking at Beijing's approach to the region and its people, this is a real blind spot, because they tend to look at these kinds of mega projects, whether it's mega projects in terms of development or mega projects in terms of, large dams, large projects in that sort of way. They tend to look at them as being important ways of modernization and development, and the human costs of those projects are a secondary consideration. And certainly this has been carried out in a lot of Han Chinese areas. So it's not something unique to these minority nationality areas. But when it is applied to minority nationality peoples, you have that erosion of their particular cultural, religious sites, and it has a significant impact on them, with an intention of full-scale assimilation as well. And in terms of the, wide-scale environmental damage that is caused by these projects, I guess what I could say is that, Tibetans know, as do all minority nationalities, that these large-scale development projects do have significant environmental costs. And by way of comparative analysis, if you think about the large cotton farms that went into the Uyghur homeland after annexation, that had a significant impact on the Karez system out there, which was an important water irrigation system of thousands of years of age. Many of those Karez are now completely dried up, or they're so polluted the water can't be used. So minority nationality peoples are aware of these kinds of environmental impacts of these big projects. Tibetans know that when it comes to environmental protection in these frontier regions, the environment is secondary to the extractive colonizing goals of Beijing. So nobody's really surprised when these projects are announced and the environmental costs and tolls are raised even by Chinese geologists, Chinese environmentalists, let alone minority nationality environmentalists. And there's very little done about that because you cannot stop the modernizing developmental Chinese state. There's a real blindset there. There's a mindset of just pursuing that kind of development project at any cost. And unfortunately, the cost usually is to the detriment of minority nationality peoples in those regions.
Excellent, Anna. Thank you very much. We'll come back to discuss more about that, how the Tibetans are being displaced, particularly to discuss about the minority aspects. Antonina, over to you. How do you think it affects the ecological, ecological issues in the regions?
So if you allow me, Jagannath, I can say that kind of wrapping up this part of our discussion, it seems that we all agree that constructing river dams is a very controversial issue. So of course we consider river dams as a source of renewable energy. However, we can see how many threats are associated with it and how many severe consequences we might have. So I think it's also worth highlighting that in our discussion here, it's not about bashing China, because we would have the same problems, and we do have the very same problems when we talk about constructing river dams in Southeast Asia or in India or in Pakistan, right? We talk about relocating local population, we talk about seismic issues, we talk about landslides and so on and so forth, right? Plus, let us also remember that river dams are not always reliable, and China knows it. Remember, I think it was like a couple of years ago when there was a severe drought in China, and actually part of Shanghai went dark because there was not sufficient energy, you know, for the street lightings, and it severely affected the factory production, for example. And why was it so? Because the water level was too low for those river dams to produce sufficient energy. So it's kind of vicious circle, and China actually realized that, well, we actually might have to increase our reliance on or carbon on coal because we cannot always rely on river dams. So we can see that this is also one of the threats for China itself if it relies too much on river dam construction. So when it comes to ecological consequences, I just wanted to kind of broaden our perspective. We're not just talking about ecological consequences in Tibet per se, but because of China's activities, countries down the stream are forced to rush for securing their own water resources. And what do? They build their own dams. Look at how many dams we have in Southeast Asian countries. We have dams in India and some projects going on. And it also increases or leads to some tensions and conflicts among those countries. And look at how many water issues we do have among them. So the ASEAN countries are not a united front against China, because they are all downstream countries towards China, but some of them become upstream countries toward others, which is down the line, right? And then their actions, their dams are affecting countries down the stream. Look at India-Pakistan issue, right? When I believe it was 2020, there was a terrorist attack in Kashmir. India blamed Pakistan, and some Indian politicians raised an intriguing idea that, well, we should go against the Indus Water Treaty from 1960, and we should divert our waters back to our northern Indian territories and do not let the water flow to Pakistan, which of course was a bizarre idea. Yet you can see that it is not only China which might weaponize water against its neighbors on downstream countries. India and Bangladesh, they have a water dispute going on. Bangladesh has been complaining that India is not so happy to sit down and negotiate. India is saying, well, now Bangladesh invited so many Chinese investments that maybe we're not that much willing to talk to Bangladesh. See, they kind of, shifted the side, and now they are more pro-Chinese than pro-Indian. So you can see how many, it's like a domino effect, right? Of course, it doesn't mean that we should take our hands off China and say, well, everybody is to blame. in a way, everybody is to blame indeed. However, let us not forget that China is the first in line. It's the first factor there, right? And everything else is a kind of consequence from what China does high up in the Himalayas.
I completely agree with you, Antonina. I think that that is a well-noted point, that the idea is not to bash China, but to encourage China to have a constructive discussion on the issue, which they are not really bothering to discuss for some time. In fact, uh, as you understand, there are MOUs between India and China about sharing the data about the water flows. But these MOUs has not really been respected, as Denchen pointed out rightly. During the Duklam incident, we saw that they didn't really bother to share the data with India. So I think the idea is to have a much more constructive discussion, to look at the climate and environmental effect, and also to manage the issues, not to really encourage the region to go for a rush and for a competition on the dam construction issues. With this note, I will encourage all of you to fellow panelists to have a look at our Q&A. There are some comments. Maybe you would like to answer some of these comments. There is a question from Ethan. Maybe you would like to read this question. And then there is also a comment and question by Sisti More. So she's from Assam. She's looking more from a local point of view and trying to link it with the border dispute. So please read the questions in the Q&A box so that you could answer it during your remarks. But let me go for another and the final round of discussion, inviting your comments. That how do you really see that the international forums, particularly, let's say, UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, including platforms like Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and ICMOD, which is a Nepal-based international center for integrated mountain development. How these forums could possibly address some of these issues? Do you see any possibilities that these three particular forums can force on China to come out with more data, with more transparency, and caring for the regions, and not to really go unilaterally to construct some of these projects? Because the idea is not to really go for a competition or for a rush for the construction of the projects, but the idea is to really trying to have an environment or a space in the regions where there will be much more careful approach to protect the environment, the degrading environment in the Himalayan regions as well as in the Tibetan regions. So with this note, let me invite maybe first to you, Anna, to comment, and then Denchen, then Medha, John, and Antonina. So Anna, you would like to comment first?
Okay, thank you. So look, when it comes to any form of international institution, I think there's some significant problems that then stem from the Belt and Road Initiative. So we've seen, in Sino-Kazakh transboundary water management issues that Belt and Road Initiative agreement came into play there. And in their analysis of that, Brassett, Akhmadi, and Sternberg argued that, Kazakhstan became quite aware of how it fit with China's strategic goals within the region, and also the delicate nature of its BRI negotiations and other projects. So at the end of the day, even though water management issues were a problem for Kazakhstan in that transboundary water issue, they decided to temper their concerns, at least publicly, because they didn't want to step on the toes of Beijing. So when you're looking at these kinds of regional or international forums, membership of the Belt and Road Initiative is really quite significant there, because even within Human Rights Council, research has shown that there's been a process over the years of rewriting important articles, reframing the wording of them to weaken them from within. And, this has been reflected in attempts to vote on issues related to investigations in the situation with the Uyghur people, for instance, where countries who had Belt and Road Initiative agreements with China voted against any kind of action. So I tend to see those kinds of organizations through the lens of membership of the Belt and Road Initiative agreement, and also how significant, or how do they acquire arms from the Chinese state? Because within certainly some analyses of the Human Rights Council and votes within it, arms sales and the desire for continuing arms sales from China was also motivating votes, and it was silencing voices within those sorts of organizations. So I think this flows over, no pun intended, to transboundary water management issues as well. And we also have seen China really not upholding agreements that it has signed and terms that is agreed to. So whilst there should be a continuation of these kinds of efforts and these negotiations, and they're very good also at drawing attention to breaches that could then perhaps have an impact in bringing states to account on these kinds of water issues and modifying their behavior. And it's not only China, obviously. I think, we need to continue with that. But in terms of my own research on China's behavior within international institutions over particularly the Xi Jinping years, we've seen quite a departure away from China being a state that will comply with those kinds of regulations and act within them, particularly as its power has increased and it's decided that, it has a stronger role to play in setting the parameters of these kinds of agreements and conditions.
Thank you, Anna. Denshin?
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier that there are many international agencies like ICMOD, as you've mentioned. As an intergovernmental institute, I think they should promote and encourage Chinese government to have dialogue with the downstream countries and get into the transboundary water treaties and encourage Chinese government to have multilateral agreement. So framework like UN Water Course Convention and the Mekong River Commission, this also serves as a model from where the Chinese government and all the downstream countries can engage with. So as we know that Chinese government is one of the two countries that have voted against the UN Water Course Convention, and China, they doesn't have any kind of water treaties with any of the downstream countries. So although like Chinese government, they have they play as an observer members in the Mekong River Commission, and they do share the year-round data of the water. But we know that the Chinese government have a huge pressure on the Mekong River Commission, and likewise, if they have this Indian government and the downstream Bangladesh, if they can, have a diplomatic engagement with China, and have some similar kind of data sharing or water sharing agreement with the Beijing, it would be very useful in future, I guess. So other than this, the downstream countries, it is very important for downstream countries to raise this concern with China more forcefully, and it shouldn't be a part of a simple dialogue and asking the Chinese government for the transparency and consideration for the downstream countries. They should be more, stressed and more forcefully. The Indian government should approach the Chinese government, and it should not be, as we know that there's a high stake at risk, because with the damming of Yarlung Tsangpo, it will eventually have huge impact on the Indian side and also to the Bangladesh. So, as I mentioned earlier, that at the COP conference, there are many countries who, representative who comes to the COP, and it is a platform where they can engage with the Chinese representative and have talk about the water and transboundary water sharing agreement. And other than this, it is important to have coordination about the coordination with within the downstream countries, and engage and also the Western countries, the climate activists and Western nations, particularly those who are funding those climate initiatives, they should also play and demand accountability from China, because what happened in Tibet, it affects the lifeline of millions of people. So protecting these Tibet is not just a regional imperative, but also have global responsibility. So coordinated efforts at COP conferences and also beyond can also pave way for towards a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Detention. Before I come to you, John and Medha and Antonina, there is one more question which is raised by Giulia from ISDP. She's asking that regarding the Yarlung Tsangpo, are there any third parties that have raised a statement regarding this issue, particularly the Chinese construction activities? And alternatively, is there any state that has endorsed this initiative? If you could comment on some of this. Also, she asks, is there any particular state-owned enterprises or any other types of firm that is pushing towards the realization of this dam? Further, she asks that how China has responded to the affected parties' allegations of jeopardizing the life of the local community. So if you could comment on some of these questions that are raised by Srishti and Athens and Giulia, that would be also interesting. Over to you, John.
So I think to add to what the previous speakers have said, what can be done at international level, it's very hard these days to make China do things. You can scrutinize its green claims, you can condemn where it's causing harm to Tibet and its people and its ecosystems. All of this is holding the line. You shouldn't stop doing it just because it's not having immediate effect. It would be worse if this wasn't being repeatedly mentioned. These concerns shouldn't be allowed to drop off. But what you need to do in the meantime is sort of think about the things that you can control. And I think one of them is international governments might want to focus on some of the big state companies that are involved in some of these projects. So to take the example of the Kamtok Dam, the one that's going to flood 6 monasteries, which as Detention mentioned, have priceless cultural heritage. The company carrying that out is ultimately China Huadian. They're the one responsible for it. They're one of the big 5 energy companies. They have international investors, a small number, and they also entered into a partnership with Siemens Energy last year. And I think we should be looking to put pressure on Siemens to distance itself from a company that's causing harm to Tibet. In terms of international platforms, I think things like COP, I know that they're criticised a lot by climate activists because not a lot comes out of them, and civil society is increasingly closed off from decision makers. But I think if governments were serious about raising Tibet, they should be thinking about ways to platform Tibetan experts, give them a stage to speak directly about the effects of the climate crisis on the Tibetan people, as a counter to the Chinese government acting as their intermediary. It should be Tibetans that are able to express in their own voice what the mining and mega development projects are doing to exacerbate the climate crisis on their land, and how it's done things like upturned the traditional way of life of rural Tibetans, the millions of Tibetan nomads who've been forced off their land, but prior to that had stewarded it for generations, and counterbalance some of these Chinese narratives around how grazing by yaks is destroying Tibetan pastures, or how Tibetans who are being moved from rural areas are being moved into what they call productive labor, distancing themselves from, countering the narrative that China sometimes comes out with, that rural Tibetans and the nomadic lifestyle is unscientific or backward or in some way not modern. I think there are lessons to be learned from Tibetans, as there are from other frontline communities, about how they manage the land. The International Panel on Climate Change has mentioned that before. It's made some useful comments, particularly regarding frontline communities in North America and the Arctic, around the uses of indigenous knowledge in tackling the climate crisis. So I think governments and climate NGOs need to find creative ways to give Tibetans the space to speak not just as victims, but also as people that have experience of managing land and might even have solutions.
Excellent point. Medha, do you have anything to share from Indian perspective? You are muted. Please unmute yourself.
So yes, I mean, taking that conversation forward, I think when it really comes to the Indian perspective, um, India should actually pitch in for treating Tibet as global commons. And I think, this is really important. And this also really changes the larger dynamics geopolitically, because we know that Tibet is the water tower for Asia, but then of Asia. But at the same time, I think when it really comes to India's own water treaties with its neighboring countries, they also need to take cognizance of climate change. They need to take cognizance of multilateral diplomacy. But I think this is very important, given.
Hello. Medha, sorry, we lost you, so we'll come back to
The second point, yes?
We lost you. Can you please repeat it very briefly?
So yes, I mean that whole point on global commons, I think India should in fact really take it seriously, but also synergize it with its strategies and engagements with the other South Asian countries. But the second point, and the more important point, and because no one has really talked about this, is really making the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China really one of the nodal actors, because this is primarily a coalition of parliamentarians across 20-30 countries. India, EU, Japan, Australia are all part of it, and it raises issues related to human rights and democracy in China. So I think really having a very vociferous position stand here would really help. And one of the issues is also not to really look at the dams only being constructed, but in fact, really broadening the entire frame to sustainable development goals, to the issue of sustainability, to disaster resilience. Overall, also bringing in and critiquing in Chinese developmental model, I think becomes very important. you know of course, there is not much promise which is associated with multilateral forums. We saw that COP29 was essentially about climate finance. But I think the multilateral forums could be a good example of conference diplomacy. I mean, in case if you really look at some of the success stories, particularly in the 1990s with the anti-personal landmine campaign, and also the World Commission on Dams, which primarily shifted the focus on dams from primarily an economic aspect to ecological and social aspects. Many of these things were gained traction primarily because of the side events which happened while these conferences were really taking place, and while talks were going on. So I think there needs to be again a very targeted approach in offering evidence from the ground, particularly evidence from an ecological, sociological, social perspective, in terms of really telling the people about what is really happening in Tibet. And there is where I think there could be a united front of activists in this in this regard. If not all the South Asian countries, I think there we are being very ambitious. The last and the very important point, in fact, which I would like to point out, because all this sounds very ambitious, very idealistic when we say that, oh, all the downstream countries should come together. Water is the geopolitical resource. Sovereignty really matters when it comes to the sharing of these transboundary rivers. But interestingly, I would just like to put forward a case which, in fact, was pointed, which in fact is a good case in point as to how water diplomacy can really work in South Asia. And this is where I would like to get Isimode. And I'll tell you the challenges, the limitations, as well as the strengths of it. Now, one of the major ways through which we've seen some movement really happening on the front of transboundary rivers is really a networked way of doing things. And here, Isimode, in fact, really came in as one of the nodal organizations in bringing in people, states, experts together. And in a way, they really created an upper Indus Basin network, which in fact was phenomenal in terms terms of reducing uncertainty when it really comes to the issue of data sharing, issue of gloves, issue of landslides, particularly in the upper in this basin region. But one of the main limitations of this project was that most of these initiatives which we really see in South Asia coming up, paradoxically are in fact really run by these multilateral banks like the ADB, or they are funded by the World Bank. And I think some good work has really happened in South Asian regionalism, but the drivers on the seats are not the states, but these multilateral development banks. And there is where I think the limitation is, because the moment the funding stops, these networks really die out.
Right.
So I think when it really comes to, gaining traction, it's very important that at least geopolitically, the importance of the issue is raised. While we talk of geoeconomics and geopolitics, I think geoecology is a very, very important aspect which needs to be looked at when we are really talking about climate change, sustainability, green transition, renewable energy, and whatnot. But I think that discourse should not really be siloed. It should be in parallel with other kind of the geopolitical and the geoeconomic landscapes.
Right. Thank you, Meda. Antonina, you have the last word.
I have the last word, and let me try to refer to all of these questions that we got.
Right.
Academic
Right.
community, but I'll just stop here then.
Yeah, thank you, Meda. We lost you for a moment, but maybe you could share some of these points. But Antonina, over to you.
So I wanted to refer to Ethan's question, and I would say that we all agree that China does have water problems itself. That's why China is carrying out this South-North water transfer project, because northern areas of China suffer from water scarcity. We do understand it, and nobody's denying the fact that China also needs to tackle or fight its own internal problems. What I suppose we would all agree here is the criticism about how China is doing that without any input from the local population when it comes to the construction of river dams in Tibet, and without sufficient or with no consultations with international community, particularly when it comes to those downstream countries, right? So it's not really criticizing China per se because it wants to, address its own water issues. It's about how China is doing that without any regard for other communities, other countries. And of course, that China is choosing options which are perhaps not that much ecologically friendly. And also something that I wanted to add here, because here we are focusing mainly on the consequences of what China is doing. The thing is that it's very hard to negotiate with China, talk to China, because in the end of the day, Chinese politicians, journalists tend to use the same trick. You are interfering in our internal affairs, and you are actually, putting in doubt our sovereignty over Tibet. And this is always the very last kind of sentence or a summary of any kind of attempt to discuss with China. Which is not the case, because if you look even at Dalai Lama's agenda, he talks about letting Tibetans manage Tibet. He doesn't talk about independence of Tibet. He chose the middle way approach in which he wants the full autonomy of Tibet, which, as we remember, was granted many, many decades ago, right? And he believes that Tibetans know Tibet better, right? So there is no talk about Tibetan independence, right? The same if you look at US agenda. For example, in early 2021, one document was declassified. And here I'm, in a way, addressing the question of Julia, who is asking about, third parties interested in this topic. So the US declassified the so-called US Strategic Framework for Indo-Pacific, in which one of the continental challenges is water diversion by China, including Brahmaputra. Nobody talks about Tibetan independence, or nobody questions Beijing's sovereignty over Tibet. Yet, of course, you can guess China's reactions, right? Any kind of opening discussion and any kind of criticism is always seen as interference in China's internal affairs and doubting the Beijing's sovereignty over the Tibetan region. And it's kind of interesting for me to mention that right now because we are just few hours away from the second Donald Trump's term. That document I mentioned was declassified maybe 2 weeks before he ended his first term. Now we're just few hours, in the second term will come in few hours. So I guess it's interesting timing actually for me to say that. And finally, the question about Arunachal Pradesh from Shisti. So the problem is that China will not be that much stimulated or angered if Thailand goes with erecting another river dam. But it's a very different case if it is India doing the same thing in Arunachal Pradesh, because it's a disputed region. China claims it's the southernmost tip of Tibet, which actually makes things even more complicated. So even though India erects river dams in Arunachal Pradesh, claiming that we have to counterbalance China's activities and we have to prepare ourselves for droughts and floods and so on and so forth, in the end of the day, China sees it as kind of provocation by the Indian government. And that's how a vicious circle is created. Whatever the downstream countries do to counterbalance China's activities, China may perceive it as a provocation, particularly when we talk about countries which do have a border dispute. And in this case, it is, of course, India, mainly seen as by China as a country which is kind of putting doubt in China's primacy in the region and is seen by Beijing as a troublemaker.
Thank you, Antonina. I think that was excellent. Before we close this webinar, just as a final round of words from my side, if you have any final comments, Anna, John, Medha, Antonina, and Jenchen, please feel free to share it now, because we are going to close the webinar in 30 seconds or in 1 minute. You have any last words? Any last comments to offer? No. No, thank you. So I think this has been very interesting discussion today. I think the issues are going to stay alive as far as China's dam construction activities are concerned. We are going to prepare a report of this webinar. We are going to put it in the website after sharing with all the 5 speakers here. And tomorrow we are going to convene another webinar on almost similar subjects that is happening in Tibet, that is on the mining projects that the Chinese are currently engaged with, and how is it going to affect the environmental issues in the Tibetan regions as well as in the larger Himalayan regions. Those who are interested to know more about the mining projects that the Chinese are carrying out, what would be the impact on the ecological aspects there in the Tibetan Plateau, please join us tomorrow at the same time. That is Stockholm time at 2 p.m. We will have some of the finest experts on the subject who have written and done some research on the mining issues. They will be joining. But with this note, let me thank all my esteemed speakers today. Your remarks have been really insightful and we have been benefited. We'll stay in touch with you. And also to all of our participants who are joining and listening, please follow our websites for the latest publications that we are coming out on the subject. There will be a couple of write-ups very soon will be coming by John and Antonina and some of the other experts on the subject. So please follow up our website. You will see the latest writings on the subject so that you will be benefited in your research. The idea is not to really bash China. The idea is to, raise international awareness on the subjects, what is happening on the Tibetan and Himalayan regions, and how we could negotiate or create that necessary platform for a better negotiating platform with China on the issues that we are discussing, from ecological challenges to many infrastructural activities that the Chinese are carrying out. With this note, let me thank all of you. And again, thank you very much. And my team here in ISDP, I've been very privileged to have their helping hand. I thank Anna Jarmuth and also my interns colleagues here, Gulia and also Toby, who has been really helpful for arranging this webinar. Thank you, Halim, very much, and have a good evening, good day ahead, and see you again very soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.